It's good to be out with you all this morning. Let me just say real quick that Briar and I have very much enjoyed being here this semester. It's been a blessing for us to get to know all of you, and you all have been such an encouragement to us. Immediately when we got here, everyone was so hospitable and received us very quickly, and it was just great to have fellowship with you all. This is our last Sunday here. We will be here on Wednesday for the end of the semester, so we'll be back after the first of the year. But I just wanted to express my thanks for the semester and how much we've grown and been encouraged by you all. And the fellowship that we've had has just been wonderful. The last couple of weeks, we've talked about a couple different ways that we need to set our minds on things above. And a few weeks back, we talked about the book of Daniel. Hopefully you can remember that far back, and the ways that we should be focused on the kingdom that is to come, being part of a better kingdom, not the governments and the kingdoms of this world, but the spiritual kingdom of God. We also talked about seeking a heavenly city, seeking the city which is to come from Hebrews, and how we shouldn't be focused on this world, but we should be focused on heaven. We should be focused on our home with God. Well, today we're going to talk a little bit about having a new self. And instead of focusing on the things that this world would focus on and acting like the way that the world would act and walking in that way, walking with a higher calling and putting on the new self. And that's going to come from Ephesians chapter 4. If you want to turn there, that's where we're going to spend our time today. I appreciate Everett reading that passage. That's what we're going to be focusing on. I will say I am struggling with my seasonal allergies, so bear with me with that today. It sounds like some of you guys might be as well. Ephesians chapter 4. So let's read verse 1 first of all. Paul says, "Therefore I, the prisoner of the Lord, implore you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you have been called." From there he goes on to talk about how to walk in a manner worthy of the calling in a way that's unified. So throughout chapter 4, Paul is going to talk about this walk that we ought to have, and this way that we ought to walk in a manner worthy of the calling, in a manner worthy of the gospel of God. And a walk implies a constant journey, not just showing up to church or just talking about God a little bit or professing to be a Christian, but a constant walk where we're learning and we're growing and we're headed towards a wonderful place. So what does it mean to walk in a manner worthy of the calling? Well, it doesn't mean that we keep the same life that we had before. It means that we are called to a totally new way of life. And it's kind of a little bit nerve-wracking when we talk about being worthy of the gospel or worthy of the calling with which we have been called. But this idea of being holy and set apart is all throughout the Bible and even the New Testament. It starts out in the Old Testament when God calls for himself his own people, and he sets apart the Israelites as his holy nation. And this nation was to be different from all the nations around them. He gives them rules and he gives them rituals and things that they ought to do in the tabernacle and in the temple that set them apart, that make them holy and pure in God's sight. And God wants us to be holy and pure as well. We are called the new Israel, the new people of God. Romans chapter 12, verses 1 through 2, some of my favorite verses in the New Testament. It says, "Therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect." I've talked about these verses a little bit before and how that word present yourselves as a living sacrifice. I believe it's particimi in the Greek word for that. It's also throughout Romans chapter 6 as well. And it's giving this idea of giving ourselves up, offering ourselves as a sacrifice for God. And that's what it says here. It says, we are to give ourselves up as a living sacrifice. Not like the sacrifices of the Old Testament, but giving ourselves up. And then it says we're to be transformed, not conformed to the world. conforming to this world and being like the people around us is being like the people that are causing the things for which Christ died for. We talked about in the high school class today how being different from the world causes the world to see Christ in us. And if we are acting the same way that the world is acting like, then what is the world going to think about Christianity? What is the world going to think about Christ? It's tempting for us to call ourselves Christians, but unfortunately act no differently from the world. And as we learn in Matthew chapter 7, that doesn't mean anything. Matthew chapter 7, verse 21. Near the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, do we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?' And I will say to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness.'" So what's the point of this passage? Well, on the day of judgment, there are going to be people who assume they're right with God by calling him Lord and going through the motions. For us, maybe we could say it as, not everyone who says to me, "Lord, Lord, did we not become baptized and show up to church on Sunday morning and take the Lord's Supper and then even come to Bible class on Wednesday night and show up to the gospel meetings?" What about all of those things? Well, those are all great things. Those are, some necessary things that God wants for us. But it's those who do the will of the Father and have the heart to do the will of the Father that will enter. God doesn't just call us to look like Christians, but to be Christians. Not just pew warmers, not just good Bible class students or someone who looks super righteous compared to the rest of the world. He didn't call us to be Christians on Sundays and Wednesdays, but he calls us to live for God, to walk for God. None of these things make us Christians. Coming to church, taking the Lord's Supper, singing, praying, those things don't make us children of God in and of themselves. Because someone can go through those motions and still not have a heart for the Lord. But God has called us to be sanctified and to do his will fully. And in order to do his will fully, you have to have a heart that's fully devoted to God. You have to have that heart that we talked about a few weeks ago. A heart after God. The word saint means holy one that is set apart and different. That's the kind of people that we are supposed to be, separate from the world. Look with me in Ephesians 4, verse 17. "So this I say and affirm together with the Lord, that you walk no longer just as the Gentiles also walk, in the futility of their mind, being darkened in their understanding, excluded from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the hardness of their heart. And they, having become callous, have given themselves over to sensuality for the practice of every kind of impurity with greediness." So Paul is encouraging the people here not to walk like the people around them, not to walk in the way that they used to, the way that the Gentiles walked. Because the people that Paul is describing here, he says that they walked in the futility of their mind. They wasted their lives and their thoughts on things that didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. How would you feel if the Lord gave this description about you, about any of us? Wasting our lives and focusing on things that don't matter. The next verses that he gives describe what this futile life looks like. Excluded from the life of God because of their ignorance. That's such a sad phrase. Let that never be said of us. Because of the hardness of their heart. That's a key phrase there. We can choose to be ignorant and be darkened because our heart is hard. Now, as a side note, I did want to say it's our responsibility as brethren in the church to keep each other from having a hard heart. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 12 and 13 talks about that, encouraging each other so that we do not become hard of heart. That's not exactly the focus of our topic today, but that is a goal that we ought to have with each other. encouraging each other and challenging each other and lifting each other up so that we don't become like this. The people that Paul is describing here in Ephesians chapter 4, he says that they have become calloused to sin. I like to play instruments. I'm not super great at instruments, but I've liked to try to learn to play the guitar, and I've never really kept with it. So what happens when I play the guitar a lot is my fingers start to hurt because you're pressing on the metal strings a lot. And because I don't keep with that, every time I start doing it again, it starts happening again. Now, when I'm consistent with it and I'm playing guitar over and over, what happens is I begin to develop calluses on my finger. And then I don't feel it anymore. And I can play it without even thinking about it. There's no more pain there because I've become callous to that. The first time we sin, our conscience may eat us alive and we may feel guilty. But eventually our conscience becomes so seared that we don't even care about it anymore. The sin becomes commonplace and normal because we have become callous to sin. I think guilt is a great God-given feeling that he's given us to help bring us back on track and bring us closer to him. I think that therapy can be very good and can be very useful for people who need it. But unfortunately, sometimes people will go there to remove their guilt. When I think that the true substance that they're looking for is redemption in Christ. So the more you sin, the more accustomed to it you will become. And then in verse 19, he says they've given themselves over to sensuality for the practice of every kind of impurity with greediness. These people just sound like awful people, but these are the kind of people that we were. And even though we may not have done these things exactly, obviously, as Romans 3:23 says, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So we all are in debt in this way. We're just like them. We've walked in the way that the Gentiles have walked. But in verse 20, he says, you did not learn Christ in this way. After this, Paul instructs us to lay aside the old self. In verse 21, he goes on to say, if indeed you have heard him and have been taught in him, just as truth is in Jesus, that in reference to your former manner of life, you lay aside the old self, which is being corrupted in accordance with the lusts of deceit, and that you may be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and put on the new self, which in the likeness of God has been created in righteousness and holiness of the truth. Put aside the old sinful man. Instead, walk in truth and in holiness. That is how you learned Christ. That is our former conduct, how we behaved before we were saved, the old man. Look at Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5. It says, therefore consider the members of our earthly body as dead to immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which amounts to idolatry. For it is because of these things that the wrath of God will come upon the sons of disobedience. And in them you also once walked when you were living in them. But now you also put them all aside, anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive speech from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, since you have laid aside the old self with its evil practices. We need to put aside the old self because the old self is never content, but it grows more corrupt, like addictive drugs. It always needs more sin. Instead, we ought to be renewed in our mind. We ought to put on the new man, which was created according to God in righteousness and in holiness. We need to set our mind on things above, like the first few verses of Colossians chapter 3 says. The walk of truth and holiness isn't just a bunch of thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that, and that sort of thing. It's not just a checklist, but the New Testament gives us a way of life. And when we don't know what to do in certain situations, we've read and we've understood and we have a relationship with God so that hopefully in those situations we react in a way that reflects God's character. This changes who we are. Remember that in baptism we die to sin, so now we can live for Christ. Read Romans chapter 6. That whole chapter talks about the new self, the old self being crucified, dying with Christ, and now living for him. And then in verses 8 through 14 of Romans chapter 6, it talks about sin not being master over us anymore. There's the idea of presenting in that chapter as well. Not presenting the members of our body for immorality, but for righteousness. So all of this sounds great. We're supposed to be different. We're supposed to be holy. We're supposed to walk differently from the way that the Gentiles did. We're to put aside the old self with its passions and its desires, and we're supposed to be transformed from the world, not conformed. But then after this, Paul gives some practical examples of what this looks like. And like I said, the Bible does not give us every single little scenario of what is wrong and what is right and what to do in certain situations. But the more that we study the Word and the more that we come to a relationship with God, the more that we will know what to do, and we will have that wisdom and we will have the character of Christ to be able to react in those situations. But Paul gives some specific examples after this in chapter 4. So look with me in verse 25. He says, "Therefore, laying aside falsehood, speak truth, each one of you, with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. Be angry, and yet do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and do not give the devil an opportunity. He who steals must steal no longer, but rather he must labor, performing with his hands what is good, so that he will have something to share with the one who has need. Let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word as is good for edification, according to the need of the moment, so that it will give grace to those who hear." So Paul gives this list of sins and contrasts them with things that we should be doing. He contrasts them with walking in a way that's worthy of the gospel, not walking like the Gentiles did. And he gives a very specific list of applications. So the first sin that he mentions is lying in verse 25, laying aside all falsehood. I don't know what these Christians were lying about necessarily, but it sounds like they may have been deceitful even towards each other, even though I don't know that for sure. But Paul says, each speak the truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. Why in the world would we lie and deceive our brethren who are members of the same body? But Paul says, lay aside falsehood and speak the truth. The old man would have used falsehood in his language, but the new man speaks only the truth. The next thing he says in verse 25, verse 26 is, be angry and yet do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. Wrath and anger are not qualities that should define a Christian's character. Yes, I believe that there are appropriate times for us to be angry with righteous indignation. Obviously, God is an angry God when it comes to sin. And I think that we should be angry at the sin around us. I think when we see the injustice, when we see innocent lives being hurt or being persecuted, or innocent babies being killed, or indecent acts all around us, that should make us angry. That should make us sad because it's hurting God. I think we should be angry when we see the innocent suffering unjustly and being treated wrongly. But that doesn't mean that we throw a tantrum and lash out at the sinners. Instead, we react in love still. We treat others with love and the selflessness that Christ would. But these are horrible things that I believe should make us upset, that make God angry. We have to be angry at the right things. Jesus was angry, but it never was selfish anger, because he was angry about the things for God. But sinful wrath and anger is not something a Christian should be participating in. When the world looks at us, we should not be defined by wrath and anger. It's one thing to be angry at the things for God, and it's another thing to be an angry person all around. Verse 31 of this same chapter says, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you. This verse says, do not let the sun go down on your anger. I don't think that the passage is literally saying, come around 5 or 6 o'clock, whenever the sun goes down, you better stop being angry right then, otherwise you're sinning. But I think it's giving this idea of, don't let it go until the next day. Don't let yourself sit and stew in that anger. Don't let the anger linger within you. And don't allow your anger to prompt sinful behavior. There are going to be things and people and situations that frustrate us. And these kind of things are going to happen to us, but we can't let ourselves stew in that anger. We have to be angry at the right things. And even when we are angry with righteous anger, we cannot let that affect us to react in sinful ways. Don't give the devil an opportunity to tempt you into sin. So, how do you control your anger? Do you give the devil an opportunity through that emotion? Because the old man would have been angry and bitter and sin in that way. But the new man will not give the devil an opportunity. The next sin that Paul talks about is stealing in verse 28. I bet that the stealing temptation is not as strong for a lot of people in the room here as maybe being too angry would be, or lying, or something like that. Maybe it's a temptation for people cheating on taxes or not doing the work at a job that you're supposed to, taking money in that way. I believe that those are forms of stealing from people. But even if stealing is not a temptation for you, I don't think that means that you're off the hook, because the next part of this verse, the opposite of stealing, is the part that steps on my toes. The contrast to stealing in this passage that Paul gives is, rather he must labor, performing with his hands what is good, so that he will have something to share with the one who has need. I usually just think of stealing as something that should be avoided, and as long as you're not stealing, then you're good. But obviously, Paul gives another part of this that is much deeper than you would think. I don't know about you, but I don't really love the word labor and work, and I don't really love to hear that. That's not just something we love to do all the time. Instead of stealing what is someone else's, Paul says you should work with your own hands so that you can give good things to other people. Stealing is a very lazy and selfish way to get what you want. But working and giving to others is what Christ would do. Sometimes we think of hospitality as just having your friends over, having people from church over. And that's great, and that's awesome, and having fellowship with each other is very important. But I think the biblical idea of hospitality is giving to people who don't have anything, having strangers into your home, taking care of the people around you. When you see someone on the side of the road that needs money, what's your reaction to that? Is it, oh, they're probably faking it. They probably don't actually need money. They're probably going to use it on alcohol or something that they don't actually need. Maybe that's true, but who are we to decide that for them? I don't give as much as I know that I am capable of or would like to. So that's a struggle. The old man would steal, but the new man would work so that he can give to other people. And then finally, in verse 29, Paul talks about speech. He says, "Let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth." I know this passage can be a little controversial when you're trying to decide what is okay to say and what's not. I think there are still some very important lessons we can learn from this verse. Because, well, sometimes it's hard to find the line of what is appropriate to say and what's not. One thing we can see for sure is that Paul contrasts this unwholesome speech with that which is good for edification. So some people think that what Paul is talking about here is filthy or crude language and inappropriate things. And some take this as just the direct opposite of edification. So don't let any discouraging words come out of your mouth. Either way, we need to get rid of anything that is discouraging and that doesn't edify the brethren. So if there's something that you're wondering if it's okay to say or not, maybe that's a sign that we shouldn't be saying it. So this includes filthy language and unhealthy criticism, but it can also maybe include harsh forms of teasing and sarcasm that doesn't build people up. Making jokes about sin, making light of the struggles of the people around us don't make for edification for the brethren. I have been shocked at some of the things and jokes that Christians are willing to say and been tempted to participate in that as well. Even excess criticism and gossiping and negative jokes, those are things which discourage people. And that is why we have to be extremely careful when dealing with our words. Even in the next chapter, in Ephesians 5, Paul, at the very first verse, says, be imitators of God as beloved children and walk in love. And then in the next few verses, he says there must be no filthiness or silly talk or coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving of thanks. So whether it be crude language or teasing or whatever else, we have to be very careful that what we are saying is encouraging to the brethren. Hebrews 3:13 says, but encourage each other day after day, as long as it is called today, so that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. Ask God for the wisdom to say the right things, to give grace to those who hear. James chapter 1 and verse 19 says, be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Whether you realize it or not, your words are going to have a major impact on the people around you. And when you say something to somebody, especially a non-believer, your words may have the power to influence them on whether they are going to be brought closer to Christ or whether your words will be a hindrance to them. And when people of the world hear your words, they're going to associate that with Christianity and with Christ. So take time to think about what you're going to say and how it will affect those who are listening. Make sure our speech is good for edification, according to the need of the moment, so that it will give grace to those who hear. The old man would speak unwholesome words, but the new man will speak things that are good for edification, giving grace to those who hear. So we are a changed people. Even though we bear the name Christians after Christ, or saints, meaning separate and holy, sometimes we don't act like it. I'm not preaching to you guys. We all do this. I don't always act like a Christian, like one who is holy and set apart. We're supposed to put off bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, slander, and malice, and be kind, tenderhearted, and forgiving towards each other. The end of Ephesians chapter 4 says that. And the next verse, like we looked at a second ago, says, therefore be imitators of God as beloved children, also loved you and gave himself up for us. It's a great summary of what it means to walk for the Lord, to walk in a manner worthy of the calling. It means to imitate God. It means to walk in love and to be loving to the people around us. It doesn't get more simple than that. But yet it doesn't get harder than that at the same time. But thankfully, when we fall short of that standard and we walk off the path, Christ is there to help us get back on and to cover our tracks where we messed up. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 14 through 16 says that you are to be holy even as God is holy. What a scary standard that is. But Christ can make us holy. That's our goal. And Christ's blood makes us pure. It's a very serious and high standard for us. But through Christ, we can be made holy. So this is our walk, walking worthy of the gospel of Christ. And these are a few examples of ways that can. But I hope that through your study of Ephesians and the other books throughout the Bible, you can learn more about how to walk worthy of the gospel in a way that's holy and pure, in a way that is characteristic of God. And if that's something that you haven't been doing, if you've fallen off the path, then you can make that right. When we're walking on this path, walking in the light, as 1 John chapter 1 talks about, every now and then we step off. It's like you're trying to balance on this curb. Every now and then you're going to step off, but you don't stay there. You get back up and you keep walking on the same path. And as long as we are trying to walk on the path, then Christ is going to help us. And if you've messed up and you've stepped off and you want to make that right and you need to tell the congregation about that, you can do that today. If you've never become a Christian and you want to be baptized so that you can join this walk and you can be saved from the sins of the world that you've been participating in, you don't want to walk like the Gentiles figuratively anymore, but you want to walk in a manner worthy of the gospel, you can do that today. If you need help, if you need encouragement, if you need prayers, let us know as we stand and sing.